Hi, everybody. I'm Darnell Moore. Really honored to moderate this conversation. I am a writer and author of the book, No Ashes in the Fire, Coming of Age, Black and Free in America. Big shout out to NewFest for hosting this conversation, to HBO for having us. We're talking about I May Destroy You, and particularly the sort of Black queer essence that's part of that series as well. Really happy to be joined by an amazing array of panelists who I am going to briefly offer some introductions of. We have Samson Ajewole, who is an actor hailing from the UK, who made his debut on In I May Destroy You, portrays Malik. Samson, welcome. Welcome. Wore this hat with London, England on it for you.
Hello. Really happy to be here. I'm really happy to be part of this conversation.
I can't wait to hear from you. We also have Dr. Durryle Brooks. Darrell Brooks, who is an early career interdisciplinary researcher and a social justice practitioner who hails from Baltimore, Maryland. And it's important to know that over the last 15 years, Dr. Brooks' research has explored the impact of systemic oppression on the holistic health of Black communities, with a focus on exploring how racism, sexism, and heterosexism impact LGBTQ people's mental, physical, spiritual, emotional, and sexual health. He's currently a research associate at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health in the Department of Epidemiology. We welcome you, Dr. Brooks.
Thank you so much, Darnell. It's so good to be here. It is so good to spend some time with you and also to spend some time with you, Samson, as well. I'm really excited for this really important conversation.
And lastly, but not least, we have Michael R. Jackson, who is an American playwright, composer, and lyricist, former neighbor of one of the Clark sisters, resides in New York City and holds BFA and MFA in playwriting and musical theater writing from NYU, Tisch School of the Arts. And for his 2019 work, A Strange Loop, which is amazing, he was awarded numerous awards, including the Pulitzer Prize for Drama. So big ups to you and welcome, Michael Jackson.
Thank you, Darnell. It's a pleasure to be here with you and everyone else.
Listen, I'm really happy to be in conversation with y'all. Y'all look beautiful. The lighting is hitting perfectly. And look, I love I May Destroy You. I think it's important to note right from the beginning that a Black woman, Michaela Coel, is the genius behind this work. And so big up to a creative, right, who was able to infuse in these short episodes, these pithy episodes, so much nuanced representation, so much Black feminist analysis. She queered not only sort of the narrative, right, but also the genre. So big shouts to Michaela Coel for this work that has galvanized so many people to be in conversation. We're particularly going to be talking about Black queer presence within the sort of narrative arc, and Kwame, this character, and yours, Samson Malik, right? Malik.
Malik.
And I want before we start, talk a little bit about Kwame in episodes 4 and 5. What happens? I want you to offer that up first, Samson. Walk us through Kwame's sort of what this sort of arc that he sort of travels through.
Okay, yeah. So from episode 1, 2, and 3, we don't see too much of Kwame. We understand that he is Arabella's best friend. We understand that he's Terry's best friend, but we don't see too much of him. But I guess his arc really does start in episode 4. And we start with him in the supermarket, looking to hook up.
Been there. True.
We start with him in the supermarket, hooking up. We kind of follow him throughout the day at work, training Arabella, training Terry. He's also like a personal trainer, kind of hit guy. And we see he meets a guy called Damon. And Damon is
that's when it starts getting real hot.
That's when it starts getting real hot. We meet Damon, and Damon is the grandson of one of the people that Kwame trains, and they kind of hit it off. And basically, they're not able to. Both of them, Kwame lives with his grandma. so does Damon. And basically, Kwame lives with his dad, Damon lives with his grandma. So they basically have nowhere to go. They have nowhere to hook up. So Kwame jumps in the apps, and he finds a third who can host. And yeah, and I guess it all kind of kicks off.
Wait, I'm looking at everybody's faces. We're all like, I've been there before. But Samson, I want you to let's talk about your character, Malik. You know, I'm interested in sort of your approach to that role as a Black queer person, and like what it meant to have to sort of lean into this character that is he sexually assaults a person. What was that like for you? What was that process like? And were you transformed in it?
You know, to be honest, first of all, I was basically really, really happy that I got to play a Black gay character. So like straight away, like my TV debut, and like I'm able to play something that's so close to home, but but something that we rarely see on TV. So I felt incredibly humbled, incredibly lucky to be given that opportunity. When I was approaching Malik, I kind of approached it in the way of not looking at Malik as if he was some sort of villain, as if he was, a bad guy, because obviously nobody's a bad person in their own story. Nobody's the evil villain in their own story, And I started off by kind of looking at the similarities between me and Malik. So, we are both Black. We're both second generation Nigerian. We both live in London. We both have families which have a religious background. We're both gay. So immediately I started to think, okay, what would it take for me to desire control in the same way that Malik does? What would it take for me to disregard another queer Black body in the same way that Malik does? What would have had to have happened in my life? And so there was already a few things that were similar for the both of us as Black gay men who have grown up in London. So obviously there's the rejection from family, there's the shame, there's the inner conflict that comes with growing up in a religious household. So all of these things. And so I kind of thought, okay, thinking about all of that, taking it to the extreme, what could have happened that would allow me to go there? And so I just kind of created a backstory using all of those things to kind of influence Malik in that way and the choices that he made. It's absolutely been such a, I know for a lot of people, it's a really, really, really tough watch. As you will know from watching the series, Michaela hasn't shied away from, the reality. She hasn't shied away from the authenticity of like what actually happens. And so I know for people it's been a tough watch, but for me, it's been the dream of my life to kind of work with Michaela, because as you said, she is a genius.
I really appreciate you offering that context. We should note that so many of those things can be really triggering for people, right? It's hard to, there's a way in which Michaela, like in a very genius way, was able to humanize like the darkest traumas that people experience as a consequence of sexual assault. That was so real. I have images that I can still see from some of the episodes that are quite ripe. So I appreciate you naming that. Michael, I'm interested in someone who, you read canons, you are in the work of representation, you're a cultural worker, and rarely do we get to see Black queer intimacy on television or the stage. Rarely do we get to see like Black queer intimacy humanized. Like rarely do we get to see like Black queer men depicted as sexual beings who are both prone to either consensual intimacy and also who can be victimized. Talk about the critical importance of this particular arc, this particular storyline in this series, how do you think that might expand Black queer representation, or at least offer a more nuanced approach to Black queer representation?
Well, I think like it's really important because, you know, there really, first of all, there just isn't any representation of the nuance within Black queer men sort of being sexual with one another.
I mean, like,
in particular,
y'all know, like they were in the store like hooking up. I'm like,
yeah,
it's
and,
real.
and just even, and just like even like in the conversation that they have sort of outside when they're trying to negotiate how they're going to be together, and you feel the intimacy between the two of them, the desire, and like that both of them are not exactly in the same sort of mental space. Like one is more experienced than the other, which then leads to the two of them then being in the space with Samson's character, like adding a third dynamic to it. And I think that like it's always really important to, you know, wherever you have like representation, to have like more than one representative. And so that you get to see these three different perspectives, all sort of at different places within their own desire for each other, let alone like how they feel about themselves, was really powerful to watch. And that's important because like it creates more of a bridge to future representations of Black queerness.
And can we get into that sex scene?
Yeah. and that was also really important to me to watch that as well, because like you normally like whenever these sex scenes are shown in like whether it's film or TV or stage or whatever, like I find that it's always quite neutered. And so I appreciated sort of seeing something like really unfiltered. And that people were like in pleasure in these unfiltered images of sexuality between two Black men. It's really important.
Samson, I'm interested. I'm going to come to you, Dr. Brooks. Get ready. I'm about to ask you something about Black manhood. But I was sitting here thinking, like, what was that like? This is a debut role for you. You know, you're a Black gay man. Like filming that scene, what was that experience like on set?
Do you know what? I think because the show is about consent, they really, 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 really put the focus on trying to make all the actors feel as comfortable and as at ease as possible. So we had this really, really amazing intimacy coach called Ito O'Brien.
Love that.
And so basically, even before we got on set, we were working on the choreography of the movements and agreeing areas of physical touch. So they really, really put an emphasis on making us feel comfortable and making the actors feel at ease, because obviously we're the ones filming the scene. It was interesting because Papa is actually straight in real life. And so I guess at first, being a gay Black man, I thought at first, I guess just from my own, my own life, that I thought this is going to be really, really difficult for me. It's going to be something. This is going to, I was really, really like focused on making sure that he felt comfortable and da-da-da-da. And so when we actually started rehearsing, it surprised me that the person who was actually uncomfortable at the start was me. Isn't that
always a story? We all got the story. Let me shut up. I was going to tell the train story. Go
ahead. It surprised me that it was me. But yeah, I mean, after that, it was a really, really safe space, and they really, really made sure we were comfortable. Yes, which made it really, really easy to film, so we could just focus on the acting.
I love that. Dr. Brooks, hi.
Hello.
I'm really interested in hearing your thoughts. Like, there are some very rigid lines that we draw around Black manhood, right? Around Black masculinity, which often obscures the ways that we too might experience harm, like sexual assault. Black men can be harmed, and we also need to have real conversations about the ways we do harm. So I want you to talk specifically about that. Like look, again, I'm shouting out Michaela Coel for like I'm like, how did you get all of this in these short, pithy episodes? Like sex positivity, like this sort of elasticity with regards to intimacy, and like sexual assault. And we get to see it through two vantage points, but specifically talk about sexual violence and its connection to Black manhood, Black masculinity, Black queer men, why we wrestle sometimes with being honest about some of the ways that we've been harmed or have harmed.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And I love hearing the perspectives of both Samson and Michael as you've kind of weighed in representation. And I think what's been particularly interesting for me growing up as a Black queer kid in Baltimore is that we began to learn early on how to begin to shift our own sort of ways of being and showing up to sort of fit these norms of masculinity. And whether you want to or not, there are all these pressures. And so I came through a religious family as well, so that there were always these structures of like, this is what is acceptable for you to do, and this is what you should be doing with your time and how you should be spending it, specifically with women, right? And so, and I think when I began to grapple with this representation of around sort of violence, sexual violence specifically, what was beginning to emerge for me was that when we begin to look in sort of like the sort of our cultural landscape, we don't often see men, particularly Black gay men, talking about the ways in which we don't somehow just automatically divest from traditional norms of masculinity, right? That's a process. That's a journey that we have to begin to sort of pull away from and pull back the curtain and sort of begin to unpack all of those gender norms and all the stuff that we picked up in our families and our friends, through our churches and places of worship, within our communities, to really begin to think about, like, who am I really as a person that is going to not be invested in perpetuating power and control that is often attached to masculinity and patriarchy. And, when I begin to do my own work, I get to figure out, oh yeah, the reason why I'm attracted to that trade, as you were about to mention, Darnell, you talk about your story, is that's a script. That is something that has been socialized as desirable, to be that type of masculine, to be that guy as read as straight and closest to that. It has all sorts of privileges conferred on it. And so from my perspective, I think it's a disservice not to talk about it. And so I appreciated this because I think it begins to point to the ways in which power, control, patriarchy, all sort of come back to, they are all accessible things for us. And we have to make an intentional decision to pull away from them in order to create health and healing for all of us.
Yeah, amen to that. Like, I'm giving you all the coins and the offering plate for that one. Like, I've been thinking a lot about, in my own life, I was sexually assaulted by a former partner when I was trying to leave the relationship, and it took me 7 years to be able to name what had happened as rape. One, because it was somebody that I had spent 7 years with, right? Two, in my mind, at the age that I was then, in my mid to late 20s, I couldn't rationalize the fact that this is where masculinity and manhood ideas get really skewed. Like, I took on this idea, like, I let that happen, right? Because men are supposed to be strong. So it took me 7 years to really, as you said, divest from this idea, this skewed idea, this cage of manhood that really had me believing that because we are two men, what had happened to me was correct, was fine. So I bring that up too, because there are so many of us for whom these experiences are not just something that we just watched on the TV screen. So many Black men a lot of Black men, Black queer men, have experienced in some of our relationships harm in this way, and I think it's important to name. And we also, in some of our relationships, have been complicit in harm of others, and creating space to sort of move through that is really important. So I want that said, Samson, I want you said a little bit about this point about consent when you were filming, but I always say, like, as I grew up, as I was socialized into sort of boyhood, into manhood, nobody taught me about consent. Nobody ever said that you have to ask that to be with someone is to engage and to be invited to be into their life, into their sort of space, into their body, right? That's an invitation. Talk about the importance of consent, what you've taken from not only sort of your role in this particular series, but how you're thinking about consent now and why it's important. And then, Michael, I'm going to come to you because I would love. You're a reader of the screen, and I'm interested. I know that you saw the differences between Kwame's reporting of sexual assault versus Arabella's process, and I want you to sort of unpack that. And then I'm going to come to you, Dr. Brooks. But if you can start, just Samson, a bit about consent, and then I want Michael to talk about the differences really that was sort of shown through Kwame's reporting of sexual assault versus Arabella's.
Yeah, I mean, so when I was looking at Malik and I was looking at the scene, I really, really wanted to kind of like focus on the fact that maybe Malik is not the perfect sexual aggressor. You know, in the fact that, you know, him and Kwame have already had sex once before. And so what I love about Michaela Coel is that she does this amazing thing. She gives you this gray area. She doesn't tell you what to think. So you have to like decide what barriers have been crossed yourself. So when I was looking at Malik and I was looking at what is the moment or that he takes that consent from Kwame, I wanted to look at it in the way that he didn't think he was. You know, he didn't active. You know, I didn't think to myself as Malik, you know, I'm actively now crossing a line and crossing a boundary. You know, it's this gray area. It's this kind of, he feels that he somehow has some kind of ownership over Kwame because of what's happened, because you've just had consensual sex. And, you know, it's really, really, the whole series has really, really made me reflect on my own life, on my own, like, my own sexual life. And I mean, it's really, really taught me just how fine that line can be. Because I guess with Malik, there is a part of him that feels like, well, I've given myself this sexual role, so therefore I can treat Kwame this way. I am this sexual role. I'm the powerful one. I'm in control, so I can take what I want. And I wouldn't necessarily say that was a conscious thing. And I think for most people, when it comes to consent and the taking the consent away from someone, I don't always think it is a conscious thing. So which is why I think I May Destroy You is so important, because then it makes you question where that line of consent is. And for me, that's probably like the most important thing, just to asking yourself, you know?
Yes. Michael, I'm interested in your response, like your read of the differences between this Black woman character's sort of process versus this Black gay male character's process of dealing with sexual assault.
Yes, but I also wanted to, if it's okay, if I wanted to respond a little bit
Yeah,
to
please.
what Samson just said, just because
Please.
like I found there were so many things that came up for me around sort of what he said and just my own thinking about this series, which is that like in my own life, which is that like I've been on both sides of this in my own life, but like been on both sides of this at very different times in the culture and in like what the language around what consent is. Sort of to your point earlier, Darnell, about like how no one's sat you down and talked to you about consent. And like for me, that was also true. But in addition to that, I then like come out, and then I enter into like a culture where norms about how gay men are with each other are extremely blurry all the time. And so then I end up having this experience where I touch someone who then they later tell me, I mean, in that moment, like this is like the early 2000s, like they're like, oh, you didn't get my consent to touch me. But like, and that was the first time that ever had been expressed to me in any way, like at all. And I felt like a deep shame immediately about it. And we worked it out amongst ourselves. But then like fast forward to like much later when like all of this language about consent is like is either more present or assumed. And then like I have an experience where someone does not ask me for consent to a certain thing, but I didn't tell them, I didn't call them on it at all. And so like I just found like watching how like, you know, Kwame sort of navigates that versus even how Arabella navigates that with her second experience with I think he was Indian, and like the whole issue of the condom. Like I just found these like weird sort of like Venn diagrams of like of what's allowed. So like just with respect to your question about the different ways that they're reported, is that like it's fascinating to me that like Arabella sort of like she can't even really remember what happened. And yet in her experience, like she goes to this sort of sympathetic female Black police officer who like walks her sort of through the process of reporting, figuring out how to determine what can be done. It's like he's very believed, but at the same time, it almost seems at sometimes like Arabella doesn't even want to be that much of a bother in the reporting of her own assault. In that first instance, in that versus in Kwame's case, where he himself, like I sort of learns about consent just by listening to Arabella and like understanding, oh, this thing that happened to you just happened to me. But then like, and then he like is Googling like, what is it? Which again goes back to this thing of like, what do gay men do with each other? Like, when is it like if I'm in a bar, if I'm in New York City and I'm at the Cock, what are the rules?
Come on, a cop.
You know, and like and that for me was another real thing. Like I only very recently in the last year went to the Cock for like the first time. And like there it's like you can do whatever you want. But then once you leave that space, once you go home with someone from there, then what are the rules? In both directions. So like Kwame, you know, he goes to the police officer. And then he's speaking to another Black man. He's not speaking to a Black woman. And the Black man is just kind of like, so what was his name? And he doesn't understand how Grindr works. He doesn't understand what the rules are either, but he expects for Kwame to be able to just deliver him sort of a perfect package of assault. And like, and I think that Kwame probably on some level, also because there's no penetration, and so then that also opens up this other piece about like, does there have to be penetration to be assault? Which also reminds me of this like amazing June Jordan poem called "Poem About My Rights." I recommend that anybody reads, where she sort of used that metaphor, like, is it assault if there's no penetration? Anyway, and so I find that, and then that he's forced to recount his own sort of complicity in this sexual encounter that then results in someone taking his agency away. And I think he himself is sort of questioning it, and the police officer like is not equipped to help him at all. So like you get these two instances, one where there's like this sort of perfect victim without like memory, and then you have this sort of like imperfect victim who can tell you everything that happened.
Listen, I can talk to y'all. Like, I really just want y'all in my living room, like, every day. I'm sitting here like, yes. Dr. Brooks, like, I want to be clear that, you know, to talk about Black queer male intimacy, you know, it's important to not only talk about it as a site of violence, but also as a site of radical possibility. So I want to end by really asking, like, how might we pull from the depictions offered to us through I May Destroy You to think about Black queerness as a site of radical possibility, particularly for Black men?
Yeah, so I think where my spirit goes, it says, well, you know, the system, the experience that Kwame had was what systems do for us. They ignore us and write us out of possibility. And so what was done to Kwame, which was very different from Arabella, was that his existence was minimized, and he was sort of separated from, and when I began to think about that, it was really about really denying him access to healing. and denying him access to a due process that would sort of create this moment of possibility for him to be reunited with himself again in a way that he felt comfortable, in power, and full and free like he always has been, as we see depicted him in the bathroom scene, his openness to go into a threesome. That, like, also as a sexual assault survivor, you lose something when it happens. You leave something behind that you don't touch for years. And I think for us, in terms of what healing begins to look like, that's our radical possibility. And it does not start or end with a system validating whether or not it was actually consent or rape. Actually, that was just a disservice. But I think the possibility lies in is that now that you know that I've seen you, that on this panel, and out of my research of 388 Black gay men, about 10% have reported sexual violence against them in their relationship, and then 35% of intimate partner violence broadly. What I get to see and say to you is that you're not alone. And because of that, because of the narratives that we get to see here, is that we get to create a new system. Because right now, this one, it doesn't even work for cisgender heterosexual women. God knows it doesn't work for Black gay men. And so it looked like it worked. It didn't. It does not. I talk to Black women survivors all the time, and they say it's cumbersome and it's devaluing. And so we need to take this moment to rethink what is possible from the moment of reporting to sort of what happens when systems don't show up for you. And then I think in that case, we go back to our roots. We go back to the ancestors and traditional and untraditional ways of centering ourselves and creating our own community to do some of that healing work. And so that's kind of how I begin to think about possibilities.
You done took me to church right there. I have a final question, and that is really, I think Michaela Coel has given us, and in the same way that you have, Michael, right? Like, you have offered us works that have stretched our imaginations, or what Robin Kelly calls like our freedom dream. Like, we have art that is now stretching how we might think about just the fullness of Black life. In a lot of different nuanced ways. So in your freedom dream, using I May Destroy You as a sort of launching pad sort of into our imagination, what do you see? What are your hopes for Black queer representation, Black male queer representation? If there was a show that needs to be created, that will be created, what are the characters doing? What storylines are there? I'll give you like a minute each to sort of just give me a quick snap of what that might look like for you.
I'll go last.
Okay.
Okay.
Go for it.
So, like I May Destroy You, it's not necessarily like a Black show. It's written by a Black actress. It's and a writer. The leads are Black. It's through a Black lens, but it's not necessarily overtly making a statement or a comment about race, even though it is. And for me, as a queer Black person, that would be the dream, to see all the diversity that exists within queer Black people. For me, growing up, when I thought about my Blackness and my queerness, like you said before, I felt restricted. I felt that some things in me didn't necessarily align with what it meant to be Black, and what it meant to be gay. I felt I was too Black to be gay, too gay to be Black, and I think representation matters. I think it really, really matters. And I would love to see something that was Black and queer focused, but didn't focus on the Black and queer aspects. Just queer Black people living their lives, doing their thing, facing all the trials and tribulations that come with life. That would be the dream, and that would be what I would have loved to have seen when I was growing up.
Well, Samson, I guess we're gonna be looking out for you and some of these. Maybe speak those things that are not. They were
manifested into limelight.
Dr. Brooks.
Yeah, I think similar to Samson, I feel that there is a way in which we assume Blackness is being done when we have Black people around, but we don't talk about Blackness being done and that queerness and that intersection. And sort of, I would love to have seen sort of what were the lessons about race and racism and structural inequality that would have made this particularly more sort of confrontational to those systems and those dynamics, those toxic dynamics that we see. But then I have a wish for Kwame. I wish for him to be able to not feel the guilt and the shame. I have a desire for him not to blame himself, not to begin to question whether or not that going to that grinder to find a hookup was the right thing to do, or not. I have a desire that he never sort of holds the weight or the burden of responsibility when someone else has clearly violated you and did something that you didn't consent to, and that's not your burden to carry. That I hope that he forgives himself, and we can worry about the other person later. But at the end of the day, like it's him and his work and his journey towards healing that I think, whether it's in the garden or traveling the seas or wherever you go to sort of begin to mend what was damaged. I think that's what I would hope for in my freedom dreams. We would have a space for that. Yeah.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah. So anybody who knows me knows I wear this shirt everywhere I go. It says imperialist, white strike throughs, imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist. You can't see it. Patriarchy. Hashtag bell hooks.
Come on, bell hooks.
And so the sort of, and also I'm an artist and and I have all kinds of dreams and visions for shows and things I want to see. And the thing I've been thinking a lot about is that I would like to see a show about black queerness, but really just blackness that sort of addresses the issue of sexuality from an anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, anti-patriarchal, what's the other one? Anti-patriarchal, anti-capitalist, anti-white supremacist perspective. And what that means is that, I grew up very religious as well, and with lots of guilt and shame. And so I want to see a show where black people are forced to deal with their sexuality in a truly holistic way, where that we all can come together in sort of a kind of spiritual orgy, where it's kind of you can see fat bodies, you can see disabled bodies, you can see old bodies. Our ancestors come back and they're in this orgy with us, and that the sexuality and the spirituality are bound together in a anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, anti-patriarchal framework, that we can experience sexuality and pleasure without shame, and with it in a totally sort of through the ages sort of orgasm. That's what I want to see.
I know that it's coming too.
I'm copywriting that.
Good.
So, and it's being recorded, so no one can steal that shit from me. That's my idea.
We got you. Listen, I don't have to know you brothers totally well to say I love you, and I do. This was a wonderful conversation, and Samson, to you, kudos again on this. What a wonderful debut you have. Very best. And Dr. Brooks, Michael, thank you so much for all that you all do in the world, giving us both art and also knowledge. And I just really appreciate you and this conversation. Thank you all for tuning in.
Thank you, Darnell. You're amazing. Yes, amazing host.
You're incredible. Yes. Thanks, Darnell. And thank you two gentlemen for such
I know, it's so nice to meet you, Samson and Michael.